The big sleep, unraveling a mystery you can't escape. The office was cold, the air thick with smoke. The city hummed outside, distant and indifferent. I stared at the glass of bourbon in front of me, watching the amber liquid swirl. A knock came at the door, sharp, precise. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence grow heavy. Then a voice, low, forced calm. "Private investigator?" I glanced up. A woman stood in the doorway. She was tall, dark hair, eyes too bright for the dim light. Her heels clicked as she stepped into the room. The door closed behind her, and the sound lingered like a breath held too long. She didn't sit, just stood there, staring. Her gaze was cold, calculating. I didn't move. "Are you interested in solving a problem, Mr. Marlowe?" The words sounded rehearsed. Her perfume hit me first, overpowering. Then the faint smell of something else, something metallic. I leaned back in my chair. "Depends on the problem." She reached into her purse, and I stiffened. Slow, methodical. She pulled out a photograph, tossed it on the desk. A man, a familiar face. I didn't need to look long. "Who is he?" she asked. Her voice now edged with something dangerous. "Someone I know," I said. But that wasn't the answer she wanted. She stepped closer. Too close. The air between us thickened. Her eyes narrowed. "He's been missing," she said. "For weeks." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't like this. I didn't like her. "You're not the first to ask me about him," I said, trying to sound casual. She didn't blink. I could feel her watching me, waiting for me to slip, but I didn't. Yet. I reached for the photograph. The edges were worn, as if it had been handled too many times. The man in the picture, his eyes were dark, hollow. Suddenly, I wanted to throw it back at her, but I didn't. I placed it down gently. "What's the real story here?" I asked. Her lips curled into something like a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You'll find out soon enough," she said. Then she turned and walked out. The door clicked shut behind her. I sat there in the silence, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Something was wrong. I could feel it, deep in my bones. I didn't know it yet, but I would find out that I stayed in my chair for a moment. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. The photograph on the desk seemed to stare back at me. I reached for it, my fingers trembling. The man's face. It didn't sit right with me. Something about his eyes, they were too empty. I shoved it into a drawer and slammed it shut. I needed air, needed to think. I stood, grabbed my coat, and headed for the door. The elevator creaked as I descended. The hum of the city grew louder, sharper. The street outside was bustling, like nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake it. The woman, the photograph, the weight of her presence. I lit a cigarette, trying to steady my nerves. The smoke burned my lungs. I didn't care. I was walking now, my footsteps quick, purpose-driven. Something was off. Something was coming. I turned the corner. A shadow caught my eye. A figure standing under a street lamp. I stopped. My heart kicked up a notch. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. I hesitated. Was it him? The man from the photograph? I took a step closer, then froze. A car screeched down the street. The figure disappeared into the darkness before I could reach him. I cursed under my breath. Who the hell was he? I checked the time. The office was still hours away from closing. There was no reason to be here. No reason to be walking these streets. But something was pulling me forward, an itch in my gut. I couldn't ignore it. I turned down another alley. The sound of distant footsteps echoed. They were too fast, too rhythmic. I spun around. No one. Nothing. Just the alley stretching out behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I could feel eyes on me again. I wasn't alone, but when I looked, there was no one there. I started walking faster, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The hairs on my arms stood up, and then I saw it. A glint of metal. A knife. It was just lying there, glistening in the shadows. I stopped cold. The air felt thick, suffocating. I stepped closer. Too close. I reached for it. Then a voice. Low. Gravelly. Don't touch that. I froze. I didn't even turn around. The voice was too familiar, but I didn't know why. It felt like it was coming from all around me. The alley closed and I turned slowly. The knife was still there, glinting in the dim light. But now I could feel the weight of someone else's presence behind me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Who's there? I asked, my voice steady, but my heart was pounding. Silence. Then a figure stepped out from the shadows. A man. Tall. Broad-shouldered. He had a hat pulled low over his face. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them on me. Don't touch the knife, he repeated, his voice like gravel scraping against steel. I didn't say anything. I just stared at him. The knife between us felt like it was getting closer, even though I hadn't moved. His hand was twitching, like he wanted to reach for it. The tension in the air thickened, the kind that makes you wonder if you're about to make a mistake that'll cost you everything. I took a step back. He stepped forward. Stay where you are, he warned. I didn't listen. I shifted my weight to one foot, ready to move if I had to. Who are you? I asked again, my voice low. But he didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat. A flash of something shiny. My hand instinctively went to my own pocket, fingers brushing the cold metal of my gun. He didn't seem to notice. He pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He tossed it toward me. I caught it, unfolded it. A single word stared back at me. Run. I looked up, but the man was gone. The alley was empty. Just me. The knife. The paper crinkled in my hand. I stood there for a moment, processing. Then I ran. Down the alley, past the streetlights, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I wasn't sure who I was running from or why, but I knew I had to keep moving. I reached the end of the alley and burst out onto the street. I didn't stop. Not until I found a dark corner and pressed my back to the wall, heart racing. I didn't know if I was safe. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't over. I stayed there for a long time, pressed against the cold brick. The city noise seemed distant now, muffled. My breath still came in shallow bursts. I didn't want to look over my shoulder, but I did anyway. The street was empty. Too empty. I glanced at the crumpled piece of paper in my hand. Run. I could still hear the echo of the man's voice. That warning. The heaviness of his words. I shoved the paper into my pocket and looked around. No one in sight. But I knew better than to trust the silence. I turned down another street, walking faster now. I needed to think. I needed answers. But every step felt like I was sinking deeper into something I couldn't control. The woman, the photograph, the man with the knife. Who were they? What did they want? A shadow shifted ahead. I froze. Another figure. Closer this time. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. The figure stopped. I could feel the heat of his gaze, even without looking. Marla, the voice said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. My pulse spiked. How did he know my name? I turned slowly, forcing my body to stay calm. A man stood there. Not the one with the knife. This one was different. Slim, sharp features. A dark suit. His eyes were calm. Too calm. Who are you? I asked again, but my voice came out hoarse this time. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Not who you think, he said, stepping closer. But that doesn't matter right now. I backed away a step, my hand still resting on my gun. Then what matters? I asked, my throat tight. He took another step forward, and the tension in the air rose. The alley felt like it was closing in on me. His smile grew. You're in deeper than you realize. The question is, how far are you willing to go? I didn't answer, because I didn't know. The man didn't wait. He turned abruptly, disappearing into the shadows. For a moment, I thought about following him, but I didn't. Instead, I stood there alone again. And for the first time that night, I realized just how much danger I was in. I had no idea what was coming, but I knew it was getting closer. I didn't move. I just listened to the city hum around me. Too loud now. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the pavement. I could feel the cold creeping up my spine, but I didn't turn, not yet. I wasn't sure if I was being followed or if I was just imagining it, but something was wrong. I had to get out of here. I started walking again, faster this time. Each step felt like I was running away from something that was already too close. I took a corner, then another, not caring if I was going in circles. My mind was racing, trying to piece together the puzzle, but the edges kept slipping away. Who were these people? Why was I involved in this? I crossed another street, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the empty night. Then I heard it. A car engine, not far behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept walking faster like I could outrun it. The engine got louder, closer. I cursed under my breath and ducked into an alley. The car slowed, the headlights flashing past the mouth of the alley. I held my breath, waiting for it to pass, but then it stopped. The engine cut out. I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. Nothing. I didn't move. I stayed in the shadows, listening. The silence was too perfect, too still. And then, footsteps. Slow, measured. They were coming down the alley. I could hear them. I could feel them. The footsteps stopped, just a few feet away. I didn't dare move. A low voice came from the darkness. Looking for answers? I recognized it. The man with the hat. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. His shadow loomed over me, blocking out what little light there was. I know who you are, he said, his voice low, like he was savoring the moment. I felt my heart pound, the weight of his words sinking in. Then you know what I'm looking for, I replied, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be. The shadow shifted. A soft laugh escaped his lips. You don't even know the questions yet. I stepped back, my hand moving to my pocket, fingers brushing the gun. But he didn't move. He was too calm. Don't, he said, his voice firm, almost like a command. I froze. He was right. I couldn't fight him here. I wasn't prepared for whatever game this was. I couldn't let him see the fear creeping up inside me. But I was terrified, and I couldn't tell if he knew. Then, without another word, he turned, and the footsteps faded into the night that I stood there, heart hammering in my chest. The alley felt colder, darker now. I waited, listening to the silence swallow the last of the footsteps. My fingers still brushed the cold metal of my gun, but I didn't draw it. Not yet. I had no idea who that man was, but I knew one thing. He wasn't alone. I stepped out of the alley, keeping to the shadows. The street ahead was empty, the faint glow of streetlights barely cutting through the dark. I was on edge, every sound around me too sharp, too close. The woman, the photograph, the man with the knife, and now this one. The shadow in the alley. They were all pieces of something much bigger. I needed to find out what, but I had no idea where to start. I kept walking, every step feeling like it might be my last. I reached the corner and stopped, eyes scanning the street. Nothing. I pulled my collar up against the chill in the air and started down the next block. I had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of whatever this was. Then I heard it. A door creaking open, faint but unmistakable. I stopped dead in my tracks. A figure stepped out of a building up ahead. It was too dark to make out details, but I could tell it was a man. He paused at the doorway, as if waiting for something or someone. I couldn't move. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Was it him? The man from the alley? No. This figure was different. Smaller. He turned, heading toward the shadows of the street, blending in with the night. I waited, watching. Then, without thinking, I followed him. I stayed far behind, keeping to the darkness. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I didn't. The man walked with purpose, head down, shoulders hunched, like he was trying to disappear into the night. He didn't seem to notice me. I was closing the distance now, keeping my steps light. He turned into a side street, disappearing into an old building. I took a breath, stepped forward, and followed. The door creaked open again, barely making a sound. I slipped inside. The air was thick with dust. The smell of mildew hung in the air. I crept down the dark corridor, every footstep echoing louder than it should. The sound of voices drifted from ahead. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to listen. Then I heard a familiar name. My name. I froze. They were talking about me. I couldn't hear the words clearly, but I knew it was me they were after. I backed away, moving silently through the shadows. My hand was on my gun again. But this time, I wasn't just scared. I was angry. And I was getting closer to the truth. The voices grew louder as I crept forward, my breath shallow, each step deliberate. I pressed my back to the wall, the rough surface scraping against my jacket. I couldn't see them yet, but I could hear them clearly now. Two voices, low, muttering. One was familiar, the man from the alley. The other, I didn't recognize. I inched forward, every footstep feeling like it might betray me. The faint glow of a dim light flickered ahead. The voices came from a room just beyond the next corner. I stopped, just out of view. I needed to hear more. "She's getting too close," the familiar voice said. It was him, the man with the hat. I didn't breathe. "She's already sniffed around too much," the second voice replied, sharper now. "We should have handled this earlier." I clenched my fists, my heart thumping in my ears. Who were they talking about? Who was she? Then the first voice again. "No. We wait. She's the key." The key? What key? What the hell did they mean? I shifted slightly, straining to catch more. The second voice was quieter now. "I don't trust her. We've already lost too much time." "You don't have a choice," the first voice said coldly. "You're not calling the shots here." I took a slow, measured breath. They're talking about me. I had no doubt now. But why? Why was I the key? What was I involved in? The voices quieted for a moment, and I didn't dare move. Then a door creaked open, and I tensed. The man with the hat emerged first, his silhouette cutting through the light. He stopped, and I held my breath, praying he wouldn't turn toward me. He didn't. The other man followed, their footsteps echoing down the corridor. I waited, frozen. They were leaving. I didn't waste a second. I moved fast, slipping into the room they'd just vacated. The room was dim, filled with shadows. A desk sat in the middle, papers scattered across it. I stepped inside, my heart hammering against my ribs. I moved to the desk, the surface cluttered with files, photographs, documents. I started flipping through them, not caring if I made noise anymore. Then one photo caught my eye. It was a picture of the man I'd seen earlier, the one from the alley. But it wasn't just him. There were other faces in the background, faces I didn't recognize. I grabbed the photo, scanning the names on the papers beside it. The words jumped out at me. Operation. The rest of it was covered by another sheet. But I didn't need to see more. I felt something shift behind me. I turned quickly, but it was too late. A figure stood in the doorway. It was him, the man with the hat. His eyes locked onto mine, cold and calculating. "You shouldn't have come here," he said quietly, his voice dangerously calm. I didn't reach for my gun. Not yet. I just stood there, staring at him, waiting for the next move. I wasn't sure who was hunting who anymore, but I knew one thing for sure. He stepped into the room, his shadow stretching across the floor, swallowing up the dim light. I didn't flinch, but I could feel the weight of his presence pressing against me, like he was waiting for me to make the first move. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just studied me like he was trying to figure me out. I could feel my pulse in my throat. "Do you really think you can get out of this?" he finally asked, his voice as smooth as ever, but there was something colder underneath. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because I wasn't sure myself. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken threats. He took another step forward, his eyes narrowing. "Those files," he said, nodding toward the papers on the desk, "they're not for someone like you." I stood my ground, my fingers still hovering near the gun. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice low. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly, almost like he was amused. "I think you know who I am," he said softly, his eyes locking onto mine. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" I didn't move. I didn't trust myself to, because I could feel it. This was the moment, the point of no return. I was tangled in something much bigger than I had realized, and now I couldn't walk away. The man with the hat took another step closer, but this time I didn't back down. His gaze flickered to the gun at my side. "You think you can shoot me?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "You think you can solve this with violence?" I didn't answer, but every fiber of my being screamed at me to pull the trigger, to end it now, before it got worse. But I couldn't, not yet. "Too many people are already involved," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Too many people you know." My heart skipped a beat. "Who?" I asked, barely above a whisper. His smile widened. "Everyone. The ones you trust. The ones you think you trust." The room felt like it was closing in around me. I stepped back, my mind racing. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was bigger. So much bigger. I needed answers, and I had a feeling I wasn't going to like them. The man with the hat didn't move. He was still studying me, waiting for my next move. I reached for the photo again, my fingers brushing the edges. "Who's in this picture?" I asked. He looked down at it, his face expressionless. "A part of the story you're not ready to hear yet," he said flatly. I clenched my jaw, frustration bubbling up. I wasn't going to let him control this. "Tell me the truth," I said, forcing the words out. "Why am I involved?" His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of something, regret, maybe. Or was it amusement? "You don't get it, do you?" he asked, shaking his head slowly. "You're already in the middle of it. All that's left is how you choose to play your part." Before I could react, he turned and walked toward the door. I couldn't let him leave. Not like this. "Wait," I shouted. He stopped, his hand on the doorframe. "You still have time," he said, his voice almost a whisper now, as if he was letting me in on some dark secret. "But it's running out." And with that, he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him. I stood there for a long moment, the weight of his words sinking in. I didn't know what was going to happen next. But one thing was certain. I was deeper into this than I could ever have imagined. I wasn't backing down. The room was eerily quiet again, the sound of my own breathing the only thing that filled the space. I looked at the door where he had just stood, his words still echoing in my head. "You still have time, but it's running out." The sense of urgency gnawed at me, sharper now, the weight of his warning pressing down harder with every passing second. I turned back to the desk. The papers were still there, untouched. The photograph lay in front of me, the faces in the background now haunting me with their mystery. I needed to know what this all meant. What was I really tangled in? I grabbed the photo again, studying it closely, but it didn't give me answers. The faces were blurry, too distant. There had to be something else, something more. I rifled through the papers on the desk, flipping them quickly, eyes darting from one to the next. There were names, dates, locations, but none of it made sense. It was all scattered, fragmented. I pulled out a folder that looked slightly different, more recent. Inside, there was a report. The ink was fresh, as if it had been printed just hours ago. I scanned the first few lines. It was about a deal. A dangerous one. A deal involving people I didn't know. People I couldn't trust. It mentioned the operation, the one from earlier, and linked it to a series of unsolved disappearances. The kind of disappearances that were never reported. I kept reading, and the deeper I went, the more the pieces started falling into place. But the picture that emerged was worse than I could have imagined. This wasn't just about money or power. It was something darker, more twisted. The faces in the photo were part of a network, a web that spanned across the city, maybe beyond, and I was right in the middle of it whether I liked it or not. I slammed the folder shut, heart racing. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of here before whoever was watching me found me. But as I turned toward the door, I froze. A sound. Footsteps. Someone was coming. I moved fast, ducking behind a stack of crates in the corner, my breath shallow, praying they wouldn't find me. The footsteps grew closer. They were deliberate, confident. Whoever it was, they knew exactly what they were doing. The door creaked open, and I held my breath, not daring to make a sound. The figure stepped inside, a tall silhouette. Too familiar. It was him, again, the man with the hat. He didn't speak at first, just scanned the room, his eyes methodically moving over every corner, every piece of furniture. I knew he was looking for me. He was getting closer. My fingers brushed against the cold barrel of my gun, but I didn't draw it. Not yet. He stepped closer, his footfall echoing louder now. He was just feet away from where I was hiding. I could hear his breathing, steady and slow, as if he knew I was here. And then, without turning around, he spoke. "You're not going to find the answers here." The words sent a chill down my spine. He knew I was hiding. And somehow, he knew exactly what I was looking for. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer at first. And then, in a tone that was almost too calm, he said, "Because it's already too late for you." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I was trapped. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I could get out alive, that I could feel the weight of his words settling in the air, thick and suffocating. "Too late for you." It sounded like a promise, or a warning, and it made my blood run cold. I stayed perfectly still behind the crates, my breath barely escaping my lungs. He was too close now. I could hear his footsteps moving away, each one deliberate, unhurried. He was circling the room, like a predator inspecting its prey. I gripped my gun tighter, the cold metal pressing against my palm. He stopped, his back to me, just a few feet away, my heart hammered in my chest. I was running out of time. I couldn't just wait for him to turn around. I had to move. I pushed myself up, my legs stiff from crouching so long, and in one swift motion, I reached for the door. Just as my fingers brushed the handle, I heard a voice, soft but firm. "Don't." I froze. It was him again, standing between me and the door, blocking my escape. He didn't move, didn't even flinch. Just stood there, his gaze locked on mine. I could feel the tension crackling in the air. He was too calm, too in control. For a moment, I thought I could just charge at him, take my chances. But the way he looked at me, the way he was holding himself, told me I wouldn't stand a chance. "You can't outrun this," he said, his voice still that same dangerous calm. I swallowed, trying to steady my nerves. "Then what do you want from me?" I asked, trying to sound confident, even though I felt anything but He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow step forward, then another. I instinctively stepped back, my heart racing. He stopped just a few inches away. "I want you to understand," he said softly, "that this isn't about you." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "Of course it's about me. I've been dragged into all of this." He shook his head slowly, a strange, almost pitying look in his eyes. "No, you're just a pawn. A small piece in a much bigger game." I blinked, the words sinking in. A pawn. His eyes darkened as he took a step closer, his voice lowering. "The real players are already ahead of you. And by the time you realize it, it will be too late for you to do anything." I felt the floor beneath me shift, like I was losing my balance, slipping into something darker, something far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. "I didn't ask for this," I said, almost pleading now, my voice shaking despite myself. He studied me for a moment, his face impassive. Then he stepped aside, his hand motioning toward the door. "Leave. You're free to go, but you'll never be able to outrun what's coming." My breath caught in my throat. He was letting me go. I didn't hesitate. I rushed for the door, throwing it open, and stepped into the hall. But as I turned the corner, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Across the hallway, at the far end, stood another figure. A woman. Her eyes met mine, and in that instant I knew. Asterisk, I wasn't leaving here, asterisk. She wasn't here to help me. She was here to finish what had started, that I stopped dead in my tracks. The woman's eyes were cold, calculating. There was no sign of recognition, no hesitation. Just the stark certainty that I wasn't walking out of here. My mind raced, panic clawing at the edges. I had no choice but to move. I backed up a few steps, but the hallway stretched out like a maze, with no clear way to escape. She didn't move, not yet, but she was waiting, watching. Then, without a word, she began to walk toward me. Her steps were slow, measured, like she had all the time in the world. But I didn't. I had to think fast. I glanced over my shoulder. The door to the room was still open behind me, but there was no way I could get back in without her seeing me. I needed a plan. Fast. She was getting closer now, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete floor. There was a staircase to my right. I made a split-second decision and bolted for it. I heard her footsteps quicken, but I didn't look back. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my breath coming in sharp gasps as I climbed. I could hear her behind me now, but I didn't dare slow down. The top of the stairs came into view. A narrow hallway stretched out before me. I pushed myself harder, not caring where I was going anymore. I had to outrun her. I had to get away. I reached the top of the stairs and turned down the hall, scanning for an exit any way out. Then I saw it, a door at the far end, partially cracked open. I rushed toward it, not caring if anyone was on the other side. But just as I reached the door, I heard the sound I dreaded, a soft click, a lock being turned. I slammed my palm against the door, but it didn't budge. The woman's voice came from behind me. "You can't run from this." I spun around, my chest heaving with every breath. There she was, standing at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes locked onto mine, calm, too calm. "I don't want to fight you," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. She smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was something colder, something darker. "You don't have a choice." She stepped forward, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of a gun being drawn. I reached for mine, but my hand was shaking. God, this was it. She moved closer. Her steps were steady, unhurried. "You think you have time," she said softly, almost as if she were explaining something to a child. "But you've already lost. You just don't know it yet." The gun in her hand gleamed in the dim light, pointing directly at me. My fingers brushed the grip of my own, but the tremor in my hand wouldn't stop. I wasn't sure if I could pull the trigger. I wasn't sure if I even wanted to. I didn't want to die, and I didn't want to kill her, but in that moment I knew I had to choose. Either I made a move, or I didn't make it out at all. The weight of the gun in her hand seemed to grow heavier by the second. The cold barrel, reflecting the dim light, casting long shadows across the walls. I could hear the steady rhythm of my heartbeat in my ears, each pulse a reminder of the decision I had to make: fight or submit. I could feel my fingers tighten around the grip of my own gun, but something held me back. A hesitation. A part of me wanted to find another way, to talk, to reason, to run. But deep down, I knew there was no time left for that. She took another step forward, her smile never wavering. It was unnerving how calm she was, how assured. "You really think you can stop all of this, don't you?" she said, her voice still soft, like she was trying to lull me into some twisted comfort. "You think you're the one who can change the game?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "I don't care about the game. I just want to get out of here." She stopped just a few feet away, the gun now pointed directly at me, but her gaze, her eyes, they weren't just focused on me. They were calculating, watching, waiting for me to make the first mistake. My heart raced as the seconds dragged on. I couldn't feel my legs beneath me. Everything seemed to blur. I couldn't back down. Not now. I had one shot. My fingers tightened, and I pulled my gun from the holster in one swift motion. She didn't flinch, not even a hint of surprise, but I saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes. She knew what was coming. I didn't hesitate. I fired. The sound was deafening in the narrow hallway. For a moment, everything went silent. My ears rang, and my vision blurred from the rush of adrenaline. The woman's hand jerked, the gun falling from her grip. She looked down at the blood spreading across her chest, a surprised expression crossing her face. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body felt frozen, locked in place, watching her crumple to the floor. I hadn't meant for it to go this far. I hadn't wanted to kill her, but she was right. There was no other way out. I stood there for what felt like forever, the heavy silence hanging in the air, broken only by the faint sound of her breathing, shallow and rapid. She looked up at me, eyes wide with disbelief, and for a moment there was something there, a question. But it faded quickly, replaced by nothing. She didn't move again. I stepped forward, cautiously, making sure she wasn't going to make another move. I didn't know what to feel. Guilt, relief, fear, all of it hit me at once, mixing into a strange, cold emptiness. I looked around the hallway, my mind racing for a plan. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. I turned back to the door at the far end of the hallway, the one she had locked earlier. With a quick motion, I grabbed the handle and pushed it open. I didn't look back. I just ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. I pushed through the door, not daring to look behind me. But the sound of my footsteps echoed in the hollow hallway, reminding me that I was no longer alone. The outside world felt miles away, even though the door I'd just opened led into a dimly lit back alley. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, each inhalation feeling like a gulp of cold air that only half filled my lungs. I glanced around. The alley was narrow, boxed in by two aging brick buildings. There was no one in sight, no one to stop me. I ran. My shoes slapped against the wet pavement as I sprinted down the alley, my mind frantic, spinning in every direction. There was a car parked at the far end, a beat-up sedan, its engine still warm. I didn't think about it, I just moved. I reached the car and yanked open the door, throwing myself into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the pedal to the floor. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed distance. I tore through the streets, swerving past empty cars and dark alleys, trying to shake off the feeling that someone or something was still watching me. Every glance in the rearview mirror felt like it might show a shadow, a figure closing in. "You're in deeper than you think," he said, his voice almost sympathetic. "There's no coming back from this now." I clenched my fists at my sides, but the woman kept the gun trained on me, her grip steady. It was like they'd already decided how this would play out. I wasn't part of the plan anymore. I was just the aftermath. "You don't get it," I finally said, my voice hoarse. "I didn't ask for any of this. I never wanted any part of your game." The man with the hat gave a slow nod. "No one ever does. But that's the way it works. Everyone gets caught up eventually. And when the time comes, we all play our parts." For a moment, there was silence between us, thick, suffocating, like the weight of the whole world pressing down. Then the woman stepped forward, lowering the gun. The game, it seemed, was over, but I wasn't sure who had won. As they turned and melted back into the shadows, I was left standing there alone, the echo of their footsteps fading into the night. I had no idea what had just happened, or what was going to happen next. But somewhere deep inside, I knew one thing was certain. I would never escape the web they had spun. Not now. Not ever. And as the darkness swallowed me whole, I understood. The game was never over. It was only just beginning.